So we're recording now. Hey everybody. So this is for photojournalism, spring 2021, on the lecture series that we're doing with current practitioners in photojournalism. We're going to speak today with former Milligan and Emmanuel graduate, Joel Carillet, who is a world traveler and has taken many amazing photographs over the last 15, 20 years. So I'm going to read a quick bio about Joel, and then I'm going to share some photographs that he has taken, and then he's going to speak about what he has made over this time period. So Joel graduated from Milligan in 1996, and Emmanuel getting a degree in church history, master's in church history there in 1999. He started moving toward photography around 2006 when he bought his first semi-decent camera, a Nikon D80, and traveled for a couple months to the Palestinian territories to document the socio-political environment in which the Palestinian Christian communities find themselves in. Most of his income comes from the 15,000 plus images that he has in stock library. He says that he might make more as a Walmart cashier. That's always the problem with any of the arts. He has a Patreon account that he opened about 2 years ago, where a few friends and acquaintances help supplement his income to travel and to photograph. While he certainly does some photojournalism, most of his work is more along the lines of, let's just walk around a city or countryside and see what happens. Like I think most photographers do.
Right.
Currently based in Johnson City, but since the pandemic hit, has been in Florida. I would also add that I know Joel's work about some of the most striking images I know that you've made in the last, since I've known you, are photographs from Hong Kong and the uprisings there, the protests that were happening with students. And then also photographing some of the Arab Spring in Egypt. Is that right? Am I getting that right?
Yep, that's right.
And did you photograph around Iraq as well?
I did 3 years ago.
Yeah. So those images always kind of stick in my head with your work. So everybody, I know we don't have an audience, but let's welcome Joel.
Thank you, all you invisible people.
Right.
Nice to be here, Will. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I'm going to, if I can find it, open up where is it? There it is. PDF.
Okay.
That you shared with me. So now we're sharing that. Is there like a way that we can view this better? Do you know how to?
No, let's see. That might work just like that.
There we go. Okay, and then I can make that full screen. There's that. Okay, awesome.
And just for everybody listening, this might come as a surprise, but this is my second time to do Zoom. So I've managed to avoid it during this pandemic for the most part. But
I find that impressive because
thank you. I try my best. But all right, shall I begin? Just
yeah, go for it.
Okay,
floor's yours.
Sure. So yeah, these first couple of pictures, this is from 10 years ago. Let's see, 10 years ago this month, actually, in Cairo during the uprising against the president of 30 years, Hosni Mubarak. And And I'm starting with this partly because there's something, this guy on the left with his hand raised, he is scared, he's very emotional. He's not sure what is going to happen in the next few minutes, because about 100 meters away, maybe even a bit less, there was a face-to-face battle going on between hundreds of people on either side of the political divide. And there was a worry that they were going to get into the square where the demonstrators were, and some people were predicting a massacre. And so there was like frontline people fighting, but not everybody could be on the front line fighting. And so that behind the people fighting, there were people praying, and he was one of the guys praying. And some of those people, once enough people got injured on the front line, and then they had to come back to treat their injuries, then they would go replace them on the front line. So it was an incredible thing to see. And not to overdo the comparison, but sometimes this is how I feel as a photographer. I'm not sure what the future holds. Sometimes it's pretty scary, not usually in terms of physical being, but just in terms of, we all want to have a whole life, and that includes relationships, finances, sense of purpose. And so I love a lot of what I do, but inside I look a lot like this guy sometimes. And I'm glad I have his picture, and he encourages me even 10 years later, because he could have been home in a very safe environment, but he believed in something that that brought him out into the public sphere, even though he was a little bit or a lot afraid. So this is 10 years ago this month in Cairo. And we'll scroll down. And this next picture, this was taken maybe 30 minutes later. And so the demonstrators were in this huge square. That's what you see behind them is the square. Tens of thousands of people. And there were different streets that lead into the square. And each street had people kind of guarding it. So these people were guarding one street. There was no fighting on this entrance, but a block away on the other entrance is where there was fighting at this moment. And the next picture. Okay. So part of what I want to do with my work is ask the question, who are we? And it's something I will be figuring out till the day I die. And I'm not sure what happens after we die, but maybe I'll still be figuring it out at that point as well. There's just a lot that is a mystery to me. And there's a beauty in kind of traveling into that mystery. So in my work, I want to ask the question, who are we in relation to time? In other words, I'm 47 now, and I was born at the end of the civil rights movement. So who am I in relation to, my immediate forebears and the work they did? Or who am I in relation to, the environmental changes that are happening now, but are even going to be happening more in the not too distant future, according to most people? Who am I in relation to this time? And then also, who am I in relation to each person around me? My neighbor next door, or the sex worker in Bangkok, thousands of miles away, the refugee who right now is shivering in a tent in any number of countries, the demonstrators in Burma who are standing in opposition at risk to their life against the recent coup. Who am I as I sit at this desk in Florida talking on Zoom in relation to these people? And who am I? Who are we? Um,
Is that kind of why you picked up the camera? Why?
y-
I guess I've never
yeah,
really asked you that question. Why did you start taking pictures? What drew you to photography as a way to
yeah, um,
self-expression?
it's, uh, there's different strands to that, but I'll try to make it short. One was practical. I was trying to be a writer for 3 years before this. And sometimes when I would submit stories to publications, they would ask for pictures.
Mhm.
And I usually didn't have high quality pictures that they could publish. My first digital camera was 1 megapixel. It was the still function of a camcorder.
Yeah.
Um, and So yeah, because I was writing and people were wanting pictures, I started thinking more about pictures. And I'd always loved photography, but I was also really cheap, and I didn't want to purchase the equipment or do the developing that would cost money. It was
Right.
cheaper to use a pen and paper to communicate. Um, and by the way, this is one thing I wish I had learned about 10 years earlier, that cheap is not always good. Sometimes it's good to make an investment,
Yeah.
even though it's going to be a little costly at the moment, um, because more precious than even money is time.
Mhm.
And so it's always a balance, but I would I would have been less cheap early on. Um, but yeah, and basically, I think writing was also kind of lonely. I was in my head a lot, thinking about how to craft sentences, what to say, what to share. But with the camera, it was a different way of interacting with people, um, that didn't require as much introspection. And and it was also, for someone like myself who's an introvert, the camera was a tool, an excuse to meet people.
Right.
Um,
It's kind of a separation between the self and
yep.
way to
And
get to know somebody, but not have to fully commit.
and people are less. If I go up to a stranger and say, "You look really interesting. I'd really like to talk with you," a few will say, "Hey, that's great." A few will get really scared.
Right.
um, but if I come up with a expensive looking camera and say, "I'm a photographer, may I take your picture?" and then a conversation begins, it's a way to unlock the door.
Yeah.
Um, and I have found that really helpful. And sometimes uh, the camera, I end up not even taking a picture. I usually do, but it might just lead to a conversation, which is its own thing. So, um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's an answer to that. And one more caveat: my camera broke in 2015, and I was in Latvia, and everything was going great. I was meeting all these strangers in the weeks before that, and then my camera broke, and I was on the street. I felt really naked. Um,
Sure.
and I didn't know. I would see people and I'd really want to go meet them. I'd take their picture or whatever. And I was like a really shy kid in kindergarten who didn't know how to talk with people anymore. And so that was an interesting lesson, reminder to me how much my experience in the world and in travel is connected to the camera now.
Right.
Um,
I guess come back to this image that we're looking at
mhm,
right now. With this, with all that in mind of like how you approach subjects, the camera's kind of like a way in, right?
mhm.
Conversation starter. It's a way to get to know people. And also this philosophical question of where am I in the world among other people? And I guess what is happening in this scene? How did you get into this spot? And yeah,
This this picture sort of circles back to the issue of not trying to spend too much money. In most places I go, I don't rent a car. I don't do things that have a lot of overhead, and in a lot of places that means I will hitchhike. Um, and so this is in Nagorno-Karabakh, which has actually changed political control in the last 4 years since I was there. But Nagorno-Karabakh is a disputed region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They had a huge war in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union fell apart over this territory. Armenia won. And so in this picture, I was hitchhiking with a friend, and these Armenian veterans pulled over in their old Soviet car and gave us a lift. And so, and then as we were driving, I asked if I could take a couple pictures, and they were very agreeable to that. But as we were driving, as often happens, they asked if we would like to stop at their house and have lunch before we continued our journey up the road. And so the next picture is at one of their houses. And they live right on the front line, I guess no man's land.
Sure.
My phone switched from an Armenian carrier to an Azerbaijan carrier as we approached their house, which made me a bit nervous. But
what would we call that? It'd be like what's the line in North Korea called? It's like the
demilitarized zone.
Yeah. That's
and
bad almost.
It's the demilitarized zone, but on either side of the demilitarized zone is one of the most heavily armed borders in the world in Korea. And it's and this border here is one of the top 3 most militarized borders as well.
I didn't know that.
And so you don't really see it, but it's there. And yeah, I didn't actually know that either till researching it later. But yeah, we had dinner, and while we were talking, one of the things I photograph sometimes is physical scars that people have and the story behind it. And one guy said, "Oh, well, I'll show you a scar." And then his friend said, "Oh, I'll show you a scar." And so pants started to get unbuckled. Socks started to fall down, and they were showing me different places they had been shot during the war in the 1990s. And so the next picture is just one of those, one of those shots. And so last year, less than a year ago now, a huge war broke out again in this area. First time since the early 90s that this big of a conflict happened. And Azerbaijan retook control after almost 30 years of Armenian control. And so the town where these people live, none of these men would live here anymore. It's switched sides. And so looking at these pictures now is, just conflicting emotions.
Would they have been relocated somewhere within more?
A lot of them would have gone into Armenia proper, which is not far away. And part of the territory Armenia did hold on to in a ceasefire agreement that was brokered by Russia. So they could have gone to that small part of the territory that they held, but most of the good territory was lost. And when I took this picture, I was staying in a guest house a few miles away, and the owner of the guest house, he was a veteran of the war 30 years ago, and he and his 20-something-year-old son fought in this war a few months ago as well. And his son, who we met, lost his leg. And Armenia is a really small country, and they lost more people in this, I can't remember now, 3-week conflict as a proportion of population than the U.S. lost in 10 years of the Vietnam War.
Wow.
Very interesting. But beautiful country, complicated history, and part of why Azerbaijan won this war was because of drones. They had Turkish and Israeli drones, and Armenians were prepared for land tank sort of battle, not for that kind of advanced technology. So it's really interesting, just what this small stretch of land has shown about the changing nature of war too.
Right.
All right, we can move on. This is
Uh-oh. Here we go.
Sorry. It's okay. This is a Rohingya mother and child at a refugee camp in Bangladesh, and the Rohingya are a minority group in Burma that have not been given. They've lived there in many cases for many generations, but they don't hold citizenship in Burma. So there's a few people in the world that have actually no nationality. No government gives them, no government claims them, and the Rohingya are one of those people. And what that means practically is, it's hard to get a passport if the government doesn't claim you. It's difficult for your kids to get a good education if you're not recognized as belonging to a state. And anyway, I won't go into the story of the Rohingya, but very, very persecuted people. And most Rohingya, hundreds of thousands, left in a few week period in 2017 and crossed the border. And yeah, just
where would they be crossing? I'm trying to think.
So Myanmar and Bangladesh are
Right.
they're adjacent to each other, and so yeah, people just would have walked through fields. Some would have traveled by boat along the coast, and then once they crossed the border, just within a few kilometers of the border is where the refugee camps were set up.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I'm just trying to put a mental map.
Yeah. Cool. The next picture, and this was another refugee situation 2 years earlier. This is 2015, and these are Syrian refugees arriving on the Greek island of Lesbos. And so just 5 minutes earlier, their overcrowded rubber boat hit the beach, and this was their first time stepping foot in Europe. And you can see the Turkey in the background. It's 6 miles across the water, and that's where they were coming from. And hundreds of people drowned in that stretch. It's so close, but it was a very dangerous journey. And a few hours after I took this picture, one boat sank and several people died. And it's really weird. There are places in the world that are just really weird. You're staying in a guest house, you go over to a hill and you're looking at refugees who have just, left their country, been traveling for months. Now they're making this last dangerous part of the journey, and you can watch their boat sink, and it's just a small speck out in the water, but you know that some people are dying in that instance. And you're just sitting on the beach with your camera, waiting for some to hit shore so you can photograph them. Really, really strange. And also strange, I was in Turkey 2 days earlier, but because I'm not a refugee, I was able to buy a boat ticket on a ferry for $20 and do the same journey, but on a ferry, so that I could photograph people who I'd photographed days earlier in Turkey make the same journey at risk to their life.
It's almost a certain type of privilege. Just being able to afford the ability to see these things kind of through a neutral sense and not be facing the persecution that they're facing.
It is, yeah. And it's really strange when you're saying goodbye to people in Turkey, knowing they're about to do this trip, and you're shaking hands, and you know that you're taking two very different kinds of modes of transportation against the same water. And yeah, there's just no way around it. It's not fair, and one of us is at a great advantage in this situation at this place and time.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
and it's not something that any of these locals or these people that you see, like in this picture, nobody would have been begrudging toward me about that. They would have been appreciative that you're trying to document it. But yeah, there is a tension, especially when you share a coffee with them. You learn a little bit about their story. You care about them.
Yeah.
And there's not much you can do, except for the little bit that you can do. A few days earlier when I was in Turkey, there was a Syrian mother. She was traveling alone with her son, who was, I think, in elementary school. And she said, please advise me, should I make the trip by boat tonight or not? I don't know what to do. Maybe you can help me.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a very interesting position to be in. Move on to the next picture. So travel includes a sense of the sacred, whether it's photographing the refugees, or in this case, being in Melbourne, Australia 4 years ago and walking down a street and looking at this beautiful scene through the window. Keep walking, but I'm thinking about it, thinking, man, it was just so beautiful. I just want to go take a picture of that beautiful scene of a mother and child. So I overcame my introversion and I turned around. I walked into the coffee shop, introduced myself, and I told this woman and her husband that I'm a photographer. I saw this beautiful scene. Would it be okay if I go back outside and take a picture?
Yeah.
And they said yes. And I went back in to offer to send them a copy by email. And then they said, it's cold outside. Can we buy you a cup of coffee and talk a few minutes before you continue on your way? And they were just such beautiful people. And so I use this picture to illustrate this thought. Travel includes a sense of the sacred, what is possible between strangers. The value of the spoken word, of communication, of vulnerability and openness. And yeah, so 4 years later, I still think so fondly of these people. And these are the kind of people, this is a kind of image that when I feel some discouragement, I just remember that what I do allows me to meet amazing strangers like this.
Right.
And so they're in Melbourne, Australia. Next picture. This is a young woman who I photographed in 2008. She was selling hot dogs in Granada, Nicaragua. And in 2008, there weren't a lot of people still in this part of the world anyway that had Facebook, or a lot of people didn't even have email, and she hadn't either. But one of the things I've been doing during this pandemic time of being home is going back and trying to find some people that I photographed years ago before they had contact information to give me. So long story short, I found her on Facebook last week.
Oh, wow.
And I sent her this picture. She's 21 in this picture. Now she would be 33, 32, 34. Let's say 34.
Sure.
And I didn't know if she would even see it, but she wrote back about 3 days later, and I think she was using Google Translate. But she just said, this is such a beautiful picture of myself. I am so beautiful in this picture. And it wasn't in a boastful way, and it was probably a translation thing as well. But so one of the things I like to do in my spare time is try to find some old people I photographed a long time ago and surprise them with a picture years later. And I hope to, when I'm traveling in some of these places in the future, to also find them and photograph them again.
I think that's just a good rule for anybody that is interested in photojournalism or travel or portraiture, and is to always A, get to know them, get consent first.
Yeah.
B, keep in contact, and always send the pictures to them that you took of them.
Hmm.
I think that's just, I'm sure you'll echo the same sentiment because that's what you're
Yeah.
practicing. But I think for the students that are going to watch this, like, always adhere to that in some way, right?
Yeah. And so what I do is I keep a spreadsheet with the date the photo was taken, the name, contact information if I have it or not. And then the last column is if I've sent the picture yet.
Hmm.
And then also if they've replied. A lot of people don't reply even if they receive it, but a lot of times it vanishes into a junk folder or something. But
Do you keep a notebook with you?
when,
Or do you write it in your phone whenever
it
you?
can be either, yeah, both. Sometimes I'll hand the phone over, which is usually helpful because sometimes it's hard to read handwriting later for email addresses. But yeah, so I have both, and just depends on the situation which one I use. And some photographers, a lot, in fact, really don't want to send pictures to people because it is very time consuming. If one of the things you're doing is photographing 20 people in a day, you go home from a 3-month trip and now you have hundreds of people to send photos to. There goes a month of your time back home. And so
I feel like it's like almost a moral, righteous thing to do, almost to.
and what I tell some people now is I promise in the next 5 years to send you a picture. And I'll try to do it before that, but I swear that I will send a picture, and it might, like a bottle of wine, it might get better with age. So don't worry if you don't get it right away. And that's actually true. I think if you take a picture and send it the next day, people generally won't value it nearly as much if you send it a year later,
Sure.
because they will see themselves differently a year later. And I think they'll also appreciate maybe even more you surprising them a year later. But like some photographers I really respect that do a lot of good humanitarian work, like Lindsay Adario. I took a workshop with her years ago, and she said that she doesn't send pictures to people just because of the time that would take.
Interesting.
And I get it, because I would say at least 10% of my full-time work is sending pictures to people, and I'm not getting paid for that. And most of the time I don't even get a reply from people. So it's like you're sending stuff into the
Almost
ether.
paid, right?
But there's something really good about that too.
Yeah.
Next picture. This is just another person that I had photographed in January 2002. And that's the picture she's holding. And then I was back in Egypt in 2010, and I had printed this before going to Egypt because I really I wanted to find this kid and give her this picture years later. And I went to the village where I had met her, but that village had since been destroyed. Funny backstory, it was this is near Luxor, Egypt, a lot of which was the capital of ancient Egypt. And the village was digging deep down under their, like the living room might have a huge hole in it, and they were looking for artifacts and finding some. And the government told them to stop, but they were still digging up what was beneath their village. And finally the government said, there's too much valuable stuff here, we're moving you. So you stop pillaging what's underneath your houses. And so it took 2 days with a bicycle and this picture, but I finally found her. And she had no recollection of the day we met or this picture. But and that didn't surprise me, but I was very happy to find her and give her this picture. And it's also
how did you find her? Were you just showing this picture around?
Yeah, I went to different shops that were near the village where this village was, and they told me the story of how it was demolished. And they said, and this is where a lot of the people were relocated to these ugly, cheap concrete structures the government built for them. So they said, you know, it's about 2 miles away, go try there. And yeah, I just walked around with this picture. And finally somebody said, knock on this door. I think that this is who this is.
That's amazing.
And, so yeah. All right. So yeah, what I'm hoping to do is a lot more of this sort of thing in the future, and maybe this will turn into some published project at some point. All right, next shot. And yeah, continuing with the theme of showing respect to the people you photograph and getting consent. I was on, this is in Papua New Guinea in 2017, and I was on a boat anchored just offshore. It was a scuba diving trip, and I saw these locals on the island who were having a little barbecue. And so I gingerly got in the water with my expensive camera and held it above my head and swam the 100 feet or so to the beach, and walked up and asked if I could take a couple of pictures of them. And she said yes, and gave me some of that homemade liquor she's holding in her hand. And she said, thank you. We come to this place to picnic a lot, and you're the first tourist to ask us for permission. Most just stay on the boat and take pictures of us from afar. And it's really common that people, when you ask, especially in places where there's a lot of tourists and there might be a language barrier, people really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And it's also, it's just a much better way to get good pictures. So
yes, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How do you deal with the language barrier? I feel like, I mean, do you know multiple languages, or do you just, I mean, how do you communicate with people? Do you point at the camera sometimes and just, yeah, how do you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In this picture, when I was a teenager, my family lived in Papua New Guinea, so I did speak her language. But other than that, no, I usually it's smiles and eyes and hand gestures. But a lot of it is just, you know, I heard his name is slipping me. There's a famous conflict photographer that you know, people have commented, like when he's photographing a funeral, people are in deep grief because someone just unexpectedly was killed, and he has a way of just carrying his body in that kind of sensitive setting that people can tell this man is respectful. He doesn't speak a lick of our language, but he is going about his photography in a way that shows he cares about us. You know, a little hunched over, the occasional sympathy seen in the eyes. There's all sorts of ways to communicate that you care without speaking the language. And there's all sorts of ways to see that someone else cares without speaking your language.
Non-verbal cues. Right?
Yeah. So yeah, language is really helpful for if you want a detailed story from somebody, but I find that it's often not necessary for getting permission to photograph. There's exceptions to that. Sometimes I've just wanted to say, you know, this, you want to say why you want to take the picture, but you can't communicate that.
Right.
And it would make a difference whether the person gives their consent or not. So, yeah.
Wow.
Another thing about travel is travel includes meeting people who know something that you don't. You can sort of say that about anybody we meet, but especially when you travel into different socio-political contexts, whatever news you've been watching all of your life, whatever genre of politics or books or whatever you tend to focus on, you only see a perspective. And when you're, like in this case, in the basement of a Iraqi Christian as he's investigating his house that was burned by ISIS, and now he's come back to see if it's salvageable. He has decisions to make about, do I bring my family back here? Do we start again? How do you feel at home in your country when you're a minority and sometimes part of the majority does this to your house, digs up your grandmother's grave in the cemetery and dumps her body out? And anyway, I still remember that sound of breaking glass as we walked in this basement. And this is a situation where I wish he and I spoke the same language, or I had an interpreter.
Yeah.
Because we were able to communicate a little bit, but
The fact that it's wearing sandals too. I mean, I feel like the image, I mean, yeah, there could have been obviously more to the story with verbal communication, but there's something about visual literacy and that being a message to how we learn about a situation or think about a topic or whatever's happening, if it's newsworthy, if it's art, whatever. I feel like this image holds kind of and all of these do, but this one really brings me into, like, I can feel like all the things he said about the decision making, the sadness, like, I can feel the weight of the individual and the conflict that has happened to this person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I like about it is just the symbolism of darkness and light. And even in the light, there can still be a lot of rubble. Yeah, sometimes I'll get asked, especially if it's someone in a kind of an environment where there have been a lot of photojournalists and they're in a dire situation, they've been photographed a lot, and they'll say, how will your picture help me?
Right.
None of the others have so far. And I, and sometimes you'll get, somebody will say, and you're making money from us. And so it's usually pretty easy for me to explain that would actually be like making a lot of money if I just stayed home and did something else.
Sure.
And usually people get that. And it helps them understand that's not my motivation, even if I do happen to sell a picture or two. But what I'll tell people in that situation is, yeah, I don't think my picture is going to help you. My picture is almost certainly incapable of changing your situation. It happens once in a blue moon, but that's not why I'm photographing you right now. I'm here, one, because I want to be with you at least a little bit, to be in the situation and understand your life better. But I think a lot of my photography, if it's going to make any difference, isn't going to make a difference in that immediate setting. It will make other kinds of differences in how people maybe think about the world, how they think about power. If an American sees this picture and hears more of the story behind it, and maybe in 5 years when there's talk of another war on the horizon, maybe somehow it will play into how that American citizen thinks about us going to war. Or, yeah, sort of see what I'm saying there. But
Yeah.
Most pictures I take aren't going to affect the moment, but I hope that moment will have some other effect that, again, part of the mystery of life, we don't know. We just don't know what image, what word, what action will have what effect. Yeah, I'm actually working on an essay about this right now, but
Cool.
I'm still working on articulating it, but
that's okay. It's, yeah. I think the image, what you said, and I think the image also speaks for itself as well.
Yeah. Okay, we'll move on to the next shot. And Will, you might remember this picture because I use it a lot in presentations, but this is one of my favorites. And it's partly because I was so scared for 2 weeks before I took this picture. This is in Syria in January 2013. And again, trying to travel on a budget, no kind of support network, and figuring out how do I cross from Turkey into a conflict zone where people are being kidnapped and executed on YouTube.
Yeah.
But, you know, I won't go into the nights of nausea.
Sure.
and second guessing, you know, just trying to figure out what I'm doing and why. But I'll jump ahead to when I took this picture, all the fear, all the doubts, any doubt that I had when I was facing these 4 girls. We're talking. They've all had, you know, traumatic previous year living in a war zone. And they're in this makeshift school. The ground is full of rock. And I remember kneeling into that rock and feeling it on my knees and looking at their faces. And every now and then they would smile as I made a funny face or whatever. And I just remember I had written years earlier that the craziest of things make sense when you love more than you fear. But just because I wrote that years ago doesn't mean I always feel it.
Yeah.
But when I was in front of these girls, that phrase, that was exactly it. The craziest of things make sense when you love more than you fear. So one of the scariest things I did was go to Syria in 2013. But one of the best things I've ever done as a photographer was go to Syria. And it wasn't because I wanted some glamorous adrenaline conflict shot or I was looking for fame or anything like that. It's because I got to meet kids like this and for at least a few moments be present with them. I was able to be present with my neighbors who lived in a very difficult situation. Mm-hmm. And I was able to make each of these 4 girls at some point smile. And they were able to make me smile, me who had also been kind of racked by fear for a couple of weeks. And still, you know, there's no guarantee you're going to get back across the border in Turkey at the end of the day. But that they helped give me a context, a reminder of why it's good to work through your fear. And maybe now's a good point also to say one of my philosophies in life, even though I sometimes get shaky with it, is just remember none of us are here forever. Right. And if you really think about it logically, the idea that if a person's spending all their time figuring out how can I last the longest amount of time on this earth, I think a better question to ask, how in the time that I have can I love most responsibly and fully and as a neighbor? Anyway, I really love this picture and I wonder where these girls are today.
Can I ask why it's blue?
Yeah, there is the tarp is blue.
Okay.
And so the roof
color cast almost.
Yeah, exactly. I've never been in a room that was blue like this.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So yeah, this is northern Syria. And a funny story, I did have a friend's brother who's Syrian. He went with me across the border and to kind of be my guide. And he was early 20s. And how do I put this? He was just really naive. I mentioned that there were Islamic militants that were targeting journalists for kidnapping and all that. And he said, no, it's just the Western press that wants to make us look bad. We're very hospitable, that you're fine. And I said, well, I know there's a lot of hospitality, but there are people being beheaded on YouTube.
Right.
He's like, oh no, it's just the media playing it up.
Yeah.
So we went back and forth like this, and then he talked to somebody, and there was a leader of an Al Qaeda affiliate about 3 miles away from this, where we took this picture, and he said, let's go to his house and I'll introduce you to him and I'll show you, it's all exaggerated. And I was really tempted to take him up on that, because I thought probably it would have been fine. I could have met a very interesting guy, but there's also the chance it could have turned out very badly.
Oh man, yeah, that could have been bad.
But in this camp, I did meet some fighters for an Al Qaeda affiliate, and they were all very hospitable. So it depends on the context where you meet somebody. I remember a few years ago, I met a German and a Russian that were talking together in a room, and they said that 40 years earlier, they were both in Stalingrad on opposite ends of the front line in armies that were killing each other. And they're like, what a waste, what a shame, because it's much nicer to sit and have a coffee together.
Yeah.
So it's, very interesting. All right, next picture. So one of the projects I worked on 3 years ago was I walked the Camino de Santiago, which is a medieval pilgrimage path that goes across Spain, about 500 miles. And I carried the camera the whole way and just documented the landscape and made portraits of other people walking it. And I'm hoping to make a couple books out of this eventually. Yeah. But beautiful scenery, amazing place to photograph. And I love to photograph situations like those demonstrations in Cairo, when people's faces are animated by latent convictions that are suddenly alive. It's like watching, there's so much potential in a human spirit, and we're often like dormant volcanoes that walk around. But then there are these events where we just erupt, like we are just so full of life. Yeah. And we know exactly why we're living at this moment. And we know exactly that this person is a neighbor who will stand with or die with or for. And on the Camino, it's not a protest, but there are a lot of people that are there's a certain kind of life that people walk into as they walk across Spain with a bunch of strangers from around the world that are walking in the same direction. So it's so this pilgrimage path is a cousin to a major political demonstration, in that it's the faces of the people that you photograph aren't as they would be in just a normal circumstance.
Interesting. Yeah.
So people might be carrying, their spouse that died a week earlier in their backpack, the ashes, or just the stories, and people sharing the stories, and what happens when people share these intimate stories with one another as you're walking, as your feet are touching the earth, as you're going no faster than 3 miles an hour. An amazing experience. Next picture.
I remember watching your video updates on Facebook when you were walking the trail, and that was a lot of joy for me to see those.
Yeah, thank you. I was at Starbucks this morning, and I ran into, there was people, I was reading a book about the Camino, and some people at the next outdoor table to me said, "Do you walk to the Camino?" And long story short, they've walked it 3 times. So we had a great conversation. Yeah. This picture is a monastery called Deir Marmusa in Syria. And this is the daily bread being brought up from the valley below. And I won't go into the story here, but part of why I share this picture is there are a lot of pictures I wish I had taken that I didn't. And I met the priest of this monastery who was an Italian Jesuit, and he was trying to bring people together. That's why he's rebuilding this old monastery. And long story short, he disappeared during the Syrian civil war and is presumed killed. And I regret that I never took a portrait of him when I had a chance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next shot. Another thing I love about travel is sometimes, and this has not very much to do with photojournalism, but you just meet people from the past that inspire you and remind you of how we can relate to one another. This is a Japanese diplomat. As World War II began, he was in the country of Lithuania, and won't go into his story, but there are thousands of Jews that are alive today because of this diplomat going against his own government and issuing visas that helped a lot of Jews escape the Nazis.
Wow.
And yeah, that's in Lithuania, if you want to learn more about that. Next shot. And we'll scroll on, keep on scrolling. This is a great family. I got robbed in Nepal many years ago before I was a photographer, and I shared this picture because they would be the girls would be in their late 20s now.
Yeah.
And I very much look forward to turning Kathmandu upside down in my search to find them again. When I return there one day, they taught me a lot about hospitality when I was robbed. And the mother, who didn't speak English, she translated for me, or told the daughter to translate, that I am like a son to her.
Wow.
Even though we'd known each other for an hour.
Yeah.
And they had a one-room house infested with rats at night, and they insisted I stay there the night that I got robbed, because as the mom said, when you're alone and something bad happens, you need family. So we'll be your family. And the kids spoke better English than me, really precocious and kind. And I would love to know what happened to them almost 20 years later.
And where did you say this was?
Kathmandu, Nepal.
Okay.
Next shot. The one time I've almost gotten a tattoo was I thought about getting this girl's name on my shoulder, but that seemed a little cheesy, and there was a chance it was the wrong name, so I didn't do it.
Sure.
There was confusion about whether she is Sonia or her sister, who's wearing the same shirt in the background, she was Sonia. But I was in northern Iraq, and I was hot and sweaty. I was having lunch with this family. I mean, just so hot. And there were flies buzzing around my face. And at some point, she got up from the meal, grabbed a towel, and was a human fan for the next 15 minutes while I ate. And at some point, man, she was just so nice. And at some point, I said, let's say she's Sonia. I said, Sonia, aren't your arms getting tired? And just with such dignity, she said, my arms will never get tired for you. And so she's a Yazidi, which is the most persecuted minority in Iraq. When ISIS took over their village, a lot of the women and girls were taken into sex slavery. This family lost a lot of their neighbors to that. And this was one of those moments of absolute clarity. And when it was happening, I remembered, I'm going to tuck this moment away so that I can pull it out again when I'm discouraged in this work.
Yeah.
But because I'm a photographer, I was able to be in this refugee camp, take some pictures, be the recipient of their hospitality, their food, meet this wonderful girl and her family. And I just remember thinking, at the time, ISIS was about 25 miles away. That was where the front line was, and they were in retreat, so there wasn't a danger of ISIS coming to the camp at this point. But I just remember thinking, hypothetically, if they were to come to the camp and I'm here, and because I know what beautiful people are here. This is there. There would be absolutely no doubt that I would want to be here and protect these people.
Yeah.
That whatever their lot is, my lot is going to be their lot. If I was the U.S. Embassy sent in a helicopter and said, "Hey, the American citizen can come out," I'd be like, "I don't think so. These are my people right now."
Right.
And that's an experience that's hard to get abstractly from far away. But when you're face to face, people really do become family. So anyway,
it's fascinating to see that. I think this is just kind of a universal thing that I've seen on a very micro level. You've seen it on a very macro level. But some of the most persecuted and marginalized people are generally the most hospitable and nice.
That's so true. And one thing that should teach us is how risky it is to have the kind of power that a lot of us do, or comfort.
Right.
There is something about the generosity and love that is, again, dormant volcano. There are things that can erupt from us that have a hard time erupting because of our wealth and our power and our air conditioned, or in this case, heated homes, unless you're in Texas. Anyway,
not a good joke.
But yeah, we have a lot to learn from a lot of people. Next picture. These are just a series of portraits. I love to take portraits, and I hope one day, after I photograph a few more countries, I hope to do a series of books. Like maybe I'll ask people I have I'll just send out a email to 1,000 people, say, hey, I'm looking for 100 volunteers to tell me the most beautiful story you have witnessed or experienced about love. And so have this portrait and then a story that they share. So it's a sketchy business model. I don't recommend it to anyone, but I'm doing about 20 years worth of portraits that aren't making any money at this point. And I don't think they'd make much money in the future, but I do hope that it will come to some sort of beautiful fruition in the not too distant future. So this is a park ranger in Australia. And the next picture. This is in northern Iraq. This is a Christian girl and a Muslim girl. And I love that you can't tell which is which. And they were out on a walk with their dog. And it's in some cultures more than others. There's all sorts of things to consider when taking pictures of kids. But like in this case, I wrote a note and asked them to give it to their parents, and it had my email address, explained that I was a photographer, and if they have any questions about the picture I took, or if I could send them the picture. And so the mom wrote me that night and said, thank you for the note. Yes, if you could please send us a picture. Then she wrote back and said, next time you're in our city, please be a guest in our home. You're welcome here anytime. And
that's cool.
So usually when you see pictures of Iraq, especially in a photojournalism context, it's of something bad. But here is a Muslim and Christian walking their dog, Minnie Mouse, or Mickey Mouse. Yeah, Minnie Mouse, Mickey Mouse. Yeah. This is also Iraq, this picture. Next picture. I've been working on a long-term project of photographing travelers around the world. And this is an outtake from that. Next picture. This is on the Camino de Santiago. She's from France, and amazing, amazing, amazing. In France, if you are a troubled teen, you appear before a judge because of something you've done, or social workers are afraid you're about to really get in trouble. One of the things that a judge can recommend is that you go for a 500-mile or 1,000-mile walk with a guide.
I love that.
And the idea is it will get you out of your immediate community where maybe there's a lot of bad influences, And the thinking is if you're just gone a week or two, it might not make much difference. But if you're actually out on a walk with someone who's making minimum wage, so I think she told me she's making the French minimum wage, and that's her job. She was walking with a teenage boy from France to the one end of Spain. And I said, so you're almost at the end. Do you take a bus back from this point? She says, no, we're going to walk back home. So another 700 miles. And I just thought that's what a beautiful kind of a criminal justice approach to helping kids have a different perspective on what life could hold.
Yeah.
So next picture. This is a muscular man in Morocco. He was really nice guy. This is he was the manager of the guest house that I was staying at.
Yeah.
Next shot. And this is a mother and daughter in Bali. Next shot. Again, just walking around. I was walking around for a few hours one day in Jakarta through some dense neighborhoods and came across this small courtyard, and a bunch of teens were trying out some martial arts stuff, and they let me hang out for 30 minutes and photograph. Next shot. And one of the things I always try to do if I'm traveling on a plane that has one of the flight attendant seats that face a passenger seat is I try to get that passenger seat. And then it gives me a captive audience for at least 5 minutes of the flight. And I will ask if I can take their portrait. And often you have nice light from the small window. So this is a flight attendant in Indonesia. And I sent her this picture a couple weeks later. And about 2 years later, she sent me a message. And I told her I would upload this to the stock library. And her picture was used on an Indonesian website talking about flight safety. And so she was really happy about that.
That's
and
cool.
Yeah. So those are all the pictures.
Yeah. I will attempt to stop sharing. This is always the hardest part for me. Okay, stop share. Awesome. I have so many questions, but I know we've been going for a while.
Past time. Yeah.
I guess my final question for you will be, is there any advice that you give to someone that wants to pursue a career in journalism or pursue a career in visual storytelling in some way? Some tips, some things you've learned, maybe just any kind of tidbit of information I think would maybe help some of these students out.
Yeah. I'm pretty slow to give advice because I feel like I've done so many things the wrong way. And I'm still actually figuring out the right way. So I'm actually, maybe when we're done, I'll ask you for some more advice, Will. But as someone who travels internationally a lot, if I could do my earlier mid-20s again differently, I would have spent a year someplace learning the language. Learn one of the major languages in the world. And if you're in the country learning language, you can also be doing, photography or other stuff as well at the same time. And both for the practical reasons of having language skill, but also it's just a great window, as many of you know, to just see the world differently when you have different words and sentence structures to explain the world. Don't be cheap to excess. Sometimes investment in equipment can be a good idea. And if I could do another thing over again, I would have found a mentor to actually just look at how they do their camera settings when they take a picture, how they do their editing. I feel like I invented a lot of things that I didn't need to invent. and and also it can be that's all, a mentor, and figure out how you can spend a few weeks or a few months or even a year learning from somebody else as you do your own stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I've been a little envious of people I know who, and some that started years after I did, but part of their beginning was at least a few weeks with a professional. And especially in the photojournalism world, that professional doesn't just teach you about camera settings, but introduces you to editors and stuff that just really, really helpful. So
Yeah.
that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Joel. It was a pleasure, as always, to see your work. Again, I wish we had an audience.
Thank you. Yeah, if any,
for you.
I have faith that there is someone actually out there watching this, and thank you for listening. And it was nice to be with you.
All right, I'm going to stop recording now.
All right.